To repeat, I'm Maggie Gallagher, the Benedict 16th Institute. The raffle winner will not be announced today, as I just explained, because we need to vet the winner by the security office, since we have rather widely publicized that you can have dinner with the Archbishop if you pre-order a CD or streaming service. We're excited by this conversation today. We have with us Blanton Alspaugh, the Grammy Award-winning music producer who has set beautifully the Mass of the Americas, recorded it. We have the painter, Matilda Oliveira, who is coming to us from Madrid quite late. We're really grateful to you. There's my comrade in arms, partner in all things, Director of Mission Advancement, Kevin Kakvinsky. Say hello, Kevin.
Hello, everyone. Good to have you here.
And joining us, we're very pleased to have Jay Nordlinger, who's the Arts and Culture Editor of National Review and the music critic for the New Criterion. So it's quite a distinguished panel that we have today. Kevin, in the absence of the Archbishop, do you think you could lead us in a brief opening prayer?
Sure. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Lord, we thank you for the opportunity to work towards bringing you to others through sacred beauty. This project has been such a blessing to so many, and we're excited to see the work that you are doing to bring this to the world. Bless the efforts of the Benedict XVI Institute. Please especially bless our artists and our benefactors and our patrons. Bless everyone on this call with an encounter, a deeper encounter with you. We ask this through Our Lady of Guadalupe and the Immaculate Conception. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Kevin. First of all, we have to begin with some very good news. As you may or may not know, the Blanton, the recording, what I keep calling a CD because I'm old, but the recording of the Mass of the Americas was released on Friday, and it debuted at #2 in the Amazon Hot Releases, new classical music releases. Congratulations. And then I started getting messages that Amazon has sold out. So I don't know how it can stay high on that list when they can't actually deliver you a CD until it looks like mid-October or early November, but very good news. I'm wondering if you would start us off maybe with a bit of a preview. I know that you have an essay coming out, an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal about the new renaissance in sacred music. And maybe you can tell us from your perspective, you're not Catholic, but you are yourself a Christian. And but you work in a very secular world. The classical music world is pretty, like the arts world in general now, oddly, intensely secular. So from your perspective, what are you seeing about the interest in sacred music in the secular classical world?
Well, I mean, you're right. The classical music world is largely secular, but at the same time, it's dense with sacred music. I mean, all we have to do is look at a single composer, look at Bach, look at Handel. There are oratorios, masses, requiems, Stabat Maters, on and on of works that, in most cases in the classical music world, they have both feet in the concert hall rather than in the church, but they are sacred. And then there are composers and works that really have, as you'd say, a foot in both the concert hall and the church. I mean, I think of the Rachmaninoff All-Night Vigil, not something you're going to hear really as a vigil sung in most Orthodox churches, but it grows out of that tradition, and it has found a home in concert halls and on recordings in the ears of listeners of all faiths and of no faith and all over the world. So we're at Sound Mirror and those of us who work in the classical recording field, always, I think, in contact with both secular music and sacred music, and getting it to listeners who, again, they may be mostly secular people, but they're in many cases very interested in the sacred music that we're recording. So that's the starting point for, I guess, what I would, the story I would tell about how this project came about, which is as a part of what I see from my vantage point in the producer's chair making recordings, that there's a tremendous amount of new sacred music being composed and sung and played and recorded, and it's across all of the different manifestations of the church. It's in the Orthodox Church, it's in the Reformed Church, it's in the Catholic Church, it's going beyond those ecclesiastical categories to an audience, again, that in some cases is only encountering it because it's beautiful music. But that's the starting point for a lot of people. So I mean, we see a tremendous amount of new composition happening among Orthodox composers. We see things like the Theopolis Institute undertaking a remarkable project to have composers make new chant settings of the Psalter, of all 150 Psalms, for use primarily aimed at the Reformed churches, to restore the practice in Protestant worship of chanting the Psalms. It was something that the Reformers began with, and it's kind of fallen off, but there's a renewal of interest in that. So there's that. And then, of course, there's what we're here about today, primarily, which is Frank's Mass of the Americas, which is one of the key projects of the Benedict XVI Institute.
Thank you. We'll talk more about that. I'd love to bring in Jay in a minute. Jay, in his forthcoming Wall Street Journal essay, one of the things that Blanton points out is just to reflect for a moment on the fact that two of the three most played living composers of classical music of any kind, Arvo Part and Sir James Macmillan, are devout Christians writing from and within, an evolution, not just a repetition, but clearly from their own sacred music traditions. Is that something that you've thought about at all? What should we make of that?
Well, there have always been religious composers, and there have always been composers with a spiritual streak. In fact, I think it's hard to be a musician, maybe even an artist, without at least a spiritual streak. I was thinking of a conversation as Blanton was talking, an interview I once did with Lorin Maazel, the late great conductor. And we were talking about Anton Bruckner and his symphonies. There are no words to these symphonies. Can music without words mean something? That's a very big question that's been debated for centuries. But many people think of these symphonies as prayers in sound. And I said to Maazel, do you have to be a believer, do you think, to be a conductor of Bruckner's symphonies? And he said, no, but you do need a spiritual side. Every conductor does. And I think, too, we used to have a group, we call them the Holy Minimalists. And the three I can think of are the aforementioned Estonian, Arvo Pärt, and then the Pole, Henryk Górecki. He had a huge seller in the early 90s. His Symphony No. 3 sold over 1 million copies. I think, Maggie, we could say CD at that time. I'm old-fashioned too. I don't know what to call a recording anymore. I used to say record. Then we had cassettes. And then we had John Tavener, the British composer. There was a huge hit. I remember premiere in New York of a piece by a composer named Golijhof. It was his, in Spanish, it was the Passion According to St. Mark. It's a huge hit. And then Peter Sellers, for example, has staged, mind you, the Bach Passions here in the Armory in New York. They were huge sellers, big hits. So there's a religious audience, yes, and a largely secular audience, yes, but they blend. You know, they blend. And as long as people are believers, there will be composers of religious or religiously inspired music and listeners to it, whether they think they're religious or not. It's just baked in the cake, I think.
Well, thank you for that, Jay. James, our poet in residence, you're going to read from the poems inspired by the Mass of the Americas in a little bit, but I want to bring you into this conversation. Have you poetry and music are very closely aligned. And I'm wondering if you have thought about the sense of which sacred music speaks to so many people who don't know what it is they're listening to in the way, or at least not in the way a believer does.
Well, yeah, this is can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, yeah. So this is a question that's at least as old as Alexander Pope's essay on criticism, where he speaks of oh gosh, I'm going to screw up the lines, but they come to church not for the sermons that they hear, but for the music there, something along those lines. And I do think of it because it's we know in both in all of the arts, including literature and music, that that there are people who practice the arts and who receive the arts who have, you might say, just no metaphysics, no conception of any intrinsic order to the world into which the kind of elevation these aesthetic experiences produce could possibly fit. And yet they cling to them deeply. In fact, I've been meaning to write about this for some time. One of the things that I find so fascinating about the late Polish poet Czesław Miłosz was that even in his, relatively speaking, secular leftist days when he was working for the communist regime in Poland, and was to a large extent convinced of their reason, he contemplated escaping to the United States because he didn't like the regime that was resulting, but he was afraid to leave for the United States because of the so-called spiritual desert of the United States, that somehow the United States was spiritually impoverished, whereas communist Poland somehow was spiritually rich. And I thought of, in consequence, there are passages in Marx's Communist Manifesto where he speaks of the bourgeois disenchanting the world. What I find so fascinating about that is that there are people, again, for whom, or who have no metaphysics that offers a place for the spiritual, and yet they cling to the things that we think of as of the spirit most passionately and sometimes desperately. The question is, does something happen to these intrinsically spiritual arts, if they are such, when someone no longer can take what they seem to be communicating literally? And I think that the last 100 years has shown that, yes, indeed, something happens. The spirituality becomes more vague, as in the music of Wagner, or it becomes more violent, as in Stravinsky or later composers, although I really admire Stravinsky a great deal, and he was a really religious composer. And in the other arts, this happens as well. So I would just, I'm going to sort of make it a little ellipsis just to make this comment a little bit briefer than it otherwise would be, and say all of this culminates in not a conclusion, but rather the following anecdote. And that was a number of years ago. The poet Dana Gioia and I were in a car coming from an art museum back to where we were going to do an event. And I said something about my concern for the future of poetry, as well as my concern for the future of the Catholic Church, two not necessarily related concerns. But he tied them together by saying, can you imagine an age where there are no Catholics, And can you imagine an age where anybody would read who doesn't believe that reality has its religious dimension? And I think the answer to that will always have to be no. That the arts of their very nature are speaking of the intellect and of the spirit, and finally of the sublime and the holy, even when they enter into the depths of things. And so to the extent that that dimension is quashed in people's lives, so the arts will suffer. To the extent that those things are renewed, as they seem to be in our day, I think the arts will begin to flourish.
Well, that's very interesting. It reminds me, I was at a reception last week in Washington, D.C. with the Archbishop and Frank LaRocca. And Frank said something interesting I'd not heard him say. Frank LaRocca is the composer of the Mass of the Americas and our composer in residence. He said that the short history of Frank LaRocca is was in a rock and roll band, got into Yale, got interested in classical music, became an atheist, had a stretch as a 12-tone composer, hated it, went into holy minimalism, converted to Christ through the evangelical church, and then he came back to the Catholic Church. So probably in his mid to late 40s, cradle Catholic. But he told me that he became a Catholic largely because he felt that philosophically it offered the framework for the things that he believed were true about music and beauty. And so it works in the opposite direction too, of that being pulled back. I don't want to be too sectarian. Obviously, there are fine artists who don't think of themselves as religious, and many people who are not religious who are very responsive to the arts. That is, for a Christian, that's not, or a theist, that's not hard to understand, because that seems to reflect who we are made to be, the sort of longings for things that are higher than this world. And if you don't, especially if you don't find them in religion, you go searching. But it may also explain why arts are being the wave of politics, which is just sweeping over the art world as an explanation for what is important about art. Because if you're embarrassed to talk about the soul, then you have to find some other framework to hang the thing you're spending your life doing. And I think that's challenging for many, many artists who are in fact drawn to the transcendent. Blanton, tell us a little bit about how you got involved with the Mass of the Americas and why you can only, you do this for a living, but there's only so many projects you can take on. Why did you take on the Mass of the Americas?
Well, it was actually very straightforward in a certain way. My wife and I subscribe to the Wall Street Journal and regularly read Houses of Worship on Friday. And we she read James Wilson's Houses of Worship piece. It must have been May 2021.
On St. Junipero Serra.
I think so, yes. And I was working in Dallas, so she reported to me that she just read this and read the byline at the bottom saying what James's affiliations were and the Benedict 16 Institute. And so took a look at what that was, and then saw that there was a Benedict 16 choir conducted by Richard Sparks, whom I knew through, well, for instance, a conductor who'd studied with Richard, a fine conductor named Brian Schmidt, with whom I'd made several recordings. So I just emailed Richard and I said, do you remember when we had dinner in Boston a couple of years ago? And I understand you're doing this. And if you're interested in recording the Benedict 16 choir, I'd love to talk to you. So that started the ball rolling.
So it was the quality that you knew of Richard Sparks' work, and
of course, yeah, knew the kind of conductor he is, and he's got this fascinating new project, and I offered to help if we could.
Well, we're so glad you did. Jay, have you had a chance to listen to all or parts of the Mass of the Americas?
I have indeed.
You have anything you'd like to comment about it, for good or for ill? What do you think of it?
Well, I wish the work all success. I love its craft and its sincerity and its beauty, combining the classical and the popular and the folk. There's a lot of thought and a lot of heart in it. And no wonder audiences are responding to it.
Did you have any particular, so what, this is something that classical music composers have done over the last couple of centuries, which is take folk music from a particular tradition and then kind of incorporate it into the classical music tradition. Is this something that's common in sacred music as well?
Well, it's common in music at large, and I've been thinking lately about this phenomenon of cultural appropriation. This is a buzz phrase. And I heard some lovely remarks from the pianist Andras Schiff about this, about cultural appropriation and Bach. Think of his keyboard partitas, and they're filled with dances from all over Europe, and he takes the Irish or Scottish jig and goes to town on it. And he takes French dances and German dances and sort of elevates them, certainly in my view. And there's almost no difference between culture and cultural appropriation. You use materials at hand. It's only natural. Some people are famous for it, Bartók, for example, and his fellow Hungarian Kodai. But even people who aren't famous for it, such as Mozart, do it. There are all sorts of Austrian things embedded in his music. It's only natural, And there comes a time, I think, in music when there's a certain blend of that which is high and low and medium. But I've often abided by, I love that little slogan or catchphrase of Duke Ellington. If it sounds good, it is good. And I'm a very conservative fellow, sometimes known as a right-wing fellow, though not by the current right, I must say. At the same time, well, I'll tell you a little story that will illustrate my point. I was once seated at a dinner with a famous patroness of modernism. Her name was or is, oh shoot, it's not quite coming, but she and her husband were famous as benefactors of modernist things, visual arts, and also opera productions. And someone thought he would instigate something between us and say, Jay's a big conservative, he likes traditional productions. And bless this woman, her name is Hester Diamond. And she said, the truth is, there are good traditional productions and bad traditional productions, good modern productions and bad modern productions. It's not so much the genre as the quality. There's a lot of bad sort of tonal conservative music, you might say. A lot of great 12-tone music, including music you might not know is 12-tone, like the Berg Violin Concerto. So I do like our friend Ellington. If it sounds good, it is good. And also, does it last? That should tell us something. Does it have legs?
What is your feeling about the state of new classical music generally, Jay, as long as we have you here?
I've always been a decrier, a worrier, a foe. I'm doing a little less of that now. I think that good music will always out and that there will always be an audience for it, but there may not be a big audience for it. I often say one of my lines, if I pat myself on the back, is, there's a reason they call it pop music. It's popular. Classical music is not supposed to be popular. It never has been in any time or place, despite what you may hear. But it has always been loved and nurtured and made and performed by a healthy, robust, appreciative minority. And that's what I hang my hat on. I often quote Charles Rosen, the late pianist scholar, who said, the death of classical music is perhaps the oldest tradition of classical music. And so in every generation, we say it's dying out, it's curtains, that's it, there won't be any more. And every generation is wrong. But I must say, the older I get, The more I feel it, the more I worry. I mean, probably every older person since caveman days has thought that the world was going to hell in a handbasket. And that's what I think. But I'm tempered by the knowledge that all of my predecessors thought the same thing. And we always have revivals, renaissances. So what you love, artistically, politically, whatever, may have to spend a season in the wilderness, but it's not out for good. Not many people, as I understand it, knew Johann Sebastian Bach, the kind of small g god of music who obeyed the capital G God. Not many people knew about him until he was revived by Mendelssohn, long after he was gone. So I sometimes think of these things to console myself when I worry, which I do.
Well, there's also the problem of comparing the best that has ever been created to what is being produced in one period of time.
Isn't that
Right?
true?
If you
Isn't
listen
that
to everything that was being created when Bach was writing, there would probably be you'd probably have plenty to say, well, that, you know, that
There was a time
we're
when
declining from Gregorian chant. I mean,
yeah. There's wonderful music being written today. Wonderful music. I hear it, and it tends to stand out because it's the old question of the chaff and the wheat, right?
mhm.
And one great question for performers is, do they have an obligation to perform new music? When does judgment enter? I don't know. People don't have an obligation to publish the things we write. Should new music be performed? Should they have a first hearing and a second hearing? I think so, yes. I think so, yes. And these things will be sorted out later. But it's very, very hard to be a composer and to hear nasty remarks. The composer George Rochberg once advised a young composer friend of mine, it takes an iron stomach to be a composer. Sure does.
Thank you, Jay. I'm reminded. So one of the things the Benedict 16 Institute is doing is we don't do concerts. We do liturgies. Prayer. Well, occasionally we do a concert, but in general, we do sacred music in the context for which it was written as worship, and we like to say, perhaps grandiosely, but with some justice, that we're reviving the great Renaissance and Counter-Reformation model, where new music came from the bosom of the church, and it found new audiences by moving through the great cathedrals before finally ending up in a couple hundred years at Lincoln Center in the secular music stage. And that's what really did happen with the Mass of the Americas. It was celebrated in San Francisco. It went to Tijuana. It went to this co-cathedral of the Sacred Heart in Houston. It went to a parish in Allentown, New Jersey. It went to the Basilica of Our Lady of the Immaculate Conception in DC. And it went to St. Patrick's Old Cathedral, to a church in Rome. And it was a young composer, Mark Nowakowski, who pointed out that that's extremely rare in the classical music world. Getting a premiere is difficult, but getting a second performance is hard. And the other thing I learned from Frank LaRocca, one of the early interviews that really stuck with me that I had with him, conversations, that because most of the people commissioning music are on the concert stage, there is what I want to say, a lack of on-ramps or avenues for forming composers of actual liturgical music intended for worship. I don't know, Blanton, you can jump in here too. If that strikes you as something?
Only to say yes, that's true, which points up the value of some of the things that I mentioned in my upcoming piece about the organizations and the patrons who are in fact commissioning composers to write new settings of the Mass and the liturgy and the all-night vigil, the Vespers, organizations like the Patriarch Tikhon Russian American Music Institute, commissioning composers like Benedict Sheehan and Kurt Sander, St. John of Damascus Society commissioning 6 Orthodox composers to write a remarkable setting of Psalm 103 for not only to be sung in the church, but to make a recording, to get it out. So there's a need for that, and it's being met by a lot of organizations and a lot of individual benefactors.
I was really struck, Blanton, by, I'm sorry, I forget, what is the name of the group or organization that's doing a new psalmody for?
The new chant settings of the Psalter is a project of the Theopolis Institute, which is based in Birmingham, Alabama. Peter Lightheart is the director of the institute. You probably know his name.
I was really struck by that because, of course, in the Great Schism, the Protestants view themselves as adhering to the word, right? But one of the things that happened is that because they wanted to encourage congregational singing, they created translations of the Psalms that, rhymed in the way that they thought hymns ought to, and were therefore less close to the actual sacred text.
Exactly.
And if I understand you rightly, that's part of the motivation for doing this again new, is to make sure we're singing the actual meaning of the Psalms accurately as part of the first priority.
Right. In the American colonies, what was the Bay Psalm book, 1640, was a collection of metrical translations of the Psalms. And again, you're right. The metrical translations were made so that the Psalms adhered more to norms of meter and rhyme and things like that. Very useful for congregational singing, but the metrical translation is a step away from the original text. And so a part of this Theopolis Psalter project is, in fact, to use faithful translations of the original Psalms set to be chanted in congregational settings, in fact, deliberately aimed at untrained singers, so that they can use them not only in church, but in the home.
Yeah, I guess it struck me too, because I am by no means an expert in sacred music or liturgy. I always like to tell people what I know is how to start successful nonprofit organizations. So that's why I think the Archbishop turned to me. But one of the things I learned about Gregorian chant is that the advocates of Gregorian chant appreciate that the melody of the chant adapts to the text rather than the other way around. And
Exactly.
it seemed like something of the same impulse in this new project, which I'm sure when are you going to be recording that CD?
Well, that's a project, in talking with Peter Lightheart about it, that it's still a little bit away from completion. There are a number of composers participating in it, and so where we are right now is simply having talked about it and staying in touch as it develops and reaches completion. Then we'll be able to set about recording it.
Jay, tell me what makes you optimistic. What are you most excited about in the classical music world?
Excited. Well, in the world of new composition,
Sure.
I must say, when I hear a good and worthy new composition, I really smile. It's like a flower appearing where you may not expect it. Maybe I'm a little hard on contemporary music, but I find that so much of it sounds alike. I'm always rooting for more variety. A fellow critic of mine, if I may quote myself obnoxiously, but he loved something I said. I remember this quite clearly. There was a new piece in Carnegie Hall. This was a world premiere, mind you. No one had ever heard it. And when it was over, I turned to him and said, I'm so sick of that piece. Just because it was so like so many others. And I wrote an article identifying sort of 5 common genres of new music. And one of my lines is, people say that all Vivaldi concertos sound the same. That's not true. But even if it were true, at least they have the excuse of having been composed by the same person, And there's other music pieces that sound an awful lot alike, but they're composed by different people. So in the field of new music, I'm interested in less conformity, less of a herd instinct, and more individual expression, And so I honor any good, sincere, competent effort, especially one that has some originality to it. Now, there's nothing new under the sun. To ask for something original is to ask a lot. Someone damned a recent essay of mine by saying, well, he didn't say anything new. Well, I can't think of anything new, frankly. But at least you can reiterate things freshly and appealingly.
Well, thank you, Jay. Let's take a brief break and introduce our painter, Matilda Oliveira. Matilda, say hello to everybody.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Tell us a little about your background. How did you come to be a painter, and do you paint primarily sacred subjects or a variety?
A variety, yes. So I studied fine arts here in Madrid at the university. But universities, when they teach fine arts, are kind of divided. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
So there's more the contemporary version of the arts and the teachers that are trying to teach the traditional methods. So there is a lack of that in general. So when I finished my studies at the university, I went to Florence to continue with my training, especially, the skills, the crafts. I think technique is important in every art. And in music is very, either you know your stuff or you don't. In painting is not so obvious. You can be doing anything actually without knowing the craft. So I wanted to learn the technique, so I went to Florence. There are several academies in Florence that are teaching again what they used to teach at the academies, the old academies of the 18th and 19th centuries. And well, that's a little bit of my background.
Well, tell me a minute. How do you think of yourself, your work as an artist? How would you describe what you're trying to achieve?
That's a difficult question. Difficult and easy. So I always talk about the via pulchritudinis, the way of beauty. So that appeals to me. It's a high scope, difficult to achieve, but it's what moves me to do what I do. And I know that you mentioned before comparing what you're doing to the best pieces of art that have been done. So when you compare what you're doing, it's always like, I'm too far from that. So that also moves me, because you see what others have done before you, and you think, well, if they could do it, maybe I can get closer to what they did, So,
were you surprised when we contacted you about doing the Mass of the Americas?
I was, very much, yes.
Tell me what that was like for you when I emailed you and said you want to do this.
Well, first of all, it was strange because, I guess that there are lots of artists in the United States that could do this. So why would you contact me here in Spain? That was a surprise. And also the commission itself was a surprise because what you wanted was an image where two representations of our Blessed Mother were in the same piece. And I found that weird. Like, why would you put Our Lady of Guadalupe and an Immaculate Conception both in the same image? It's like having a picture of your father when he was young and old at the same time or something like that. But then it all made sense once you explained what the commission was about. And yeah, it was...
All right, I'm going to thank you, Matilda. Can you... Kevin, I don't know if you have the link to her website, if anyone is interested in her painting, or we'll put it up in a second. I want to share screen and show the painting, which is on the liner notes. Let's see. Let me share this. There we go. This is your painting of the Mass of the Americas, and on the left is Our Lady of the Immaculate Conception, and on the right is Our Lady of Guadalupe. That little cherub with a very distinctive face is one of the members of the patron's family as a child in the great tradition of the Medicis. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about your thinking about this painting, and maybe in particular, I realize you didn't really notice this, but when I showed the Archbishop the preliminary sketch, he was like, Our Lady of Immaculate Conception isn't veiled. Is that an artist? And I was like, no, I think it's the Spanish tradition. And I went back and showed him some Murillos and a bunch of other Spanish. And he's like, well, the Spanish really came up with that. So it must be okay if they're okay with it.
Yes, in fact, when I showed you the sketch and you said that the Immaculate Conception was not recognizable, I thought, well, yes, you're right. She's not recognizable. Why is that? And I started thinking about it. And one of the first things I thought of was, of course, she's wearing a veil. I'll take that off and it will be recognizable. So it was a very interesting thing to notice that. Yes.
Right. Well, thank you, Matilda. We appreciate your work. Matilda is also working on a painting commissioned by the patron of the Messe des Malades. I don't speak French. That's the Mass for the Sick. The next great Frank LaRocca Mass, which will be celebrated for the first time at Our Lady of the Immaculate, Our Lady of the Assumption, the cathedral in San Francisco on February 11th, the World Day of the Sick. So if you can be in the Bay Area at that time, mark your calendars. The Benedict 16 choir, Richard Sparks conducting, will be providing the music for the Mass. So I know it's going to be an awesome experience. And thank you again, Matilda. I know it's very late. We appreciate your doing this.
Thank you.
James, are you there? James Matthew Wilson?
Yes, I'm here. Yep.
Oh, I'm screen sharing. That's why you're not popping up. Okay. Sorry, stop screen
That's me at the bottom.
Such a happy little chair. So I don't know if you want to, before we launch into a reading, do you have anything you want to comment about the conversation up to this point?
Well, I've so enjoyed the deepening of my own understanding of the arts that's come from my association with the Benedict XVI Institute, and it really is a pleasure to see these new voices involved and inspired to join in what the Institute is doing, whether Blanton's production of the recording, and my gratitude knowing that somebody read and appreciated and didn't write a nasty letter about the Wall Street Journal piece. And also to hear from my fellow Michigander, Jay, that a few thoughts tonight was really rewarding. And also Matilda's painting was very, very inspiring. And that's especially exciting for me. It's just the great blessing that the Mass of the Americas and what the Benedict XVI Institute has done thus far has been its curious, wayward manner of inspiring new works of art, sometimes commissioning them, sometimes just playing a germinating role. But it's, as someone who teaches Plato's Symposium on a pretty regular basis and speaks the truth when I say that the mind ascends to the eternal beauty. And what we do there is we sit and gaze and wonder, but we also begin to, as Jacques Maritain put it, begin to engender in beauty. That pure contemplation breeds new birth and fruitfulness and new creativity and new inspirations. And as someone who teaches philosophy a lot, it's all well for a philosopher to say that sort of thing. It's wonderful to actually see it occurring as it has these last 3 years in the Institute.
But tell us a little bit about how your Master's in Fine Arts program that launched last fall, I think. This is your second year, is
Yes,
that?
second year.
Which is, how many students do you have? And what
Well,
are
that's
you them?
yeah, that's been another instance of the fruitfulness, which is for the people that don't know about it. I now direct a Master of Fine Arts program that's mostly conducted online, but for the University of St. Thomas in Houston. Something I never really anticipated doing, although somewhere way back in my memories from my early graduate school days, I had told somebody someday I'm going to start a Master of Fine Arts program, but I'm not quite sure who that guy was, because I had resigned myself saying the world did not need any more graduate programs. But in fact, the world did need at least one more graduate program, because for years, people would contact me from various good smaller colleges, places like Hillsdale and Christendom, and then from Notre Dame and other places. And they'd ask where they could go to graduate school to actually study literature or to actually learn how to write. And I had no place to send them. And so it was not my choice, but it was certainly a kind of uncanny experience when it suddenly occurred to me that I could be the one to teach these people. So here we are, a year and a half on, and in the middle of our third semester of existence. And we have, I think we have about 70 students enrolled in the program. We hoped just to take about no more than 20 a year. So therefore have no more than 40 at any one time. But there were so many exciting stories of younger writers who had been looking at graduate programs and had despaired, and then they saw our curriculum and thought, this is what I was looking for, and didn't expect ever to find. And there were also just so many people who were already established as writers, some of whom had published multiple books, and they asked, some of them actually contacted me and asked if they could apply to the program, to which I thought, why would you even ask my permission? But in any case, these were people who did not need a Master of Fine Arts program, or did not think they needed a Master of Fine Arts degree to enter into the writing life, because they were already living it out, whether as editors or in publishing or as authors. But they wanted to be a part of the program because the program is itself an extension of a broader fruitfulness that praise God, is entering into the church, even when there's so much else to cause us to feel despair and dismay. I think, as I said in my first comment tonight, that people who actually care about the Spirit are people who will actually care about the things of beauty and want to shepherd these things and care for them. And those people have found a home with us, and it's just been amazing to see how many of them there are and what good work they're doing as well.
Yeah, and I know that when you start bringing people like that together, there's something explosive happens in terms of people who've been struggling alone suddenly find that they're not alone. And I was also, Matilda, struck, because that's the same experience you had as an artist, going to one of the university, looking that you have to go and find a special program to learn the craft that you want to actually practice, but the artists are persisting. So that's really wonderful news. And we're so proud of you, James. I mean, I think that that's an amazing thing. That is really potentially world-changing. And I remember back when we met, because you talked about creativity, feeding creativity, beauty, feeding beauty. And that was my model. I was like, we were going to do the Mass of the Americas in December 8th, 2018. And we were just starting out. We had hardly any money. And I'm like, what makes a work of art important is that it's fertile. It gives birth to other works of art. So I asked Dana if he would come and write a poem. And he said that he was in Southern California and he couldn't. And he said, there's this young guy named James Matthew Wilson. He's the future of Catholic letters in America. Why not ask him? And so that we're so wonderfully glad you said yes. And now we're going to turn and you're going to read from, maybe you can introduce it, but this is The River of the Immaculate Conception, which is published by Wise Blood Books. Kevin, if you have a chance to put the link, people can purchase this and enjoy this over and over again. Or we'll put up a YouTube link and you can just play it over and over again if you prefer. But tell us about what we're going to hear.
Yeah, so we can't read the whole poem, although someday I would love to read the whole poem. But so Maggie told part of the story just there, and it's funny. I realize now, and I hadn't honestly thought about this with clarity until just now, but Dana actually plays a double part in the composition of this poem. You just mentioned that he recommended me as the poet to write a poem of some kind in response to Frank's composition and to the experience of the Mass. But if people know Dana's poetry now, especially Catholic readers know his work, there's one poem of his that they will most definitely know. I know I tuned into EWTN one time by chance, and he was reading it to Raymond Arroyo, but it was The Angel with the Broken Wing, which is a poem about a santo, and it clearly a santo, a Spanish one, because, or well, it could be from the Mexican Revolution, but it's a santo that's been clipped, as it were, by a bullet during either the Spanish Civil War or during one of the Mexican revolutions. And when Dana was writing that poem, this was early on in his and my corresponding together, and he sent me the poem in draft before it was completed. He thought it needed to be a couple more sentences, or excuse me, a couple more stanzas in there. And I liked the poem a great deal. I, of course, knew and loved mission architecture and the devotional art and sacred art that tended to be inside mission churches. And so I was reading The Angel with a Broken Wing, and then just a week later, I flew with my wife and then 6-month-old daughter, today she's 16, to Tucson, where we went to the mission San Xavier de Bac, which was the northernmost mission of New Spain before you get into the California missions that St. Junipero Serra planted. And as we were walking through that beautiful church and thinking of the great sacred past of the Catholic South and Southwest of the Americas, I felt moved to write a poem. But unfortunately, this is when I was a young father struggling to try to find a job, a tenure track job at a university, and it just got pushed aside, even though there were a couple sentences in a notebook with some idea for a poem. And then Maggie came along and invited me to come hear Frank's composition. And as I was sitting in St. Mary's Cathedral, listening to the Mass, I realized what I was going to do. And I think even after the Mass, one of your guests at the reception afterwards, Maggie, hearing of the commission, said, "Oh, what is the poem going to be about?" And I said, "Well, I'm not entirely sure, but I know it's going to be called The River of the Immaculate Conception." And because I could already feel the form coming in. It was because there was so much that had been germinating from that experience in the mission from Dana's poem many years ago, and so much that had been brought from Frank's composition, and I must add, from the full liturgical embodiment of that Mass, which was not just Frank's music and not just the sacrament, but as those who were there will remember, was the pilgrimage that Latin American San Franciscans had made across the city that day before arriving at the cathedral. And then they entered the cathedral on their knees and made their way up through the center of the nave to the front and then to the right of the church, where there was a large image of Our Lady of Guadalupe. And while everybody else sat in the pews hearing and participating fully in the Mass, they participated in the Mass in a different way by staying in a position of prayer before that image. And so I tried in the poem to capture several aspects of that day and that Mass. And I think just because my story has led me to those pilgrims.
Can I pause? And
yes.
Maybe you should tell people what the River of the Immaculate Conception.
Oh, I would love to. Yeah, I'll take you through the poem. Just don't forget what I said about people kneeling. So I think I can hold this up, although it'll probably be reversed. But the River of the Immaculate Conception was the name that Father Marquette who was, as a native Catholic Michigander, was a saint of immense importance. I'm sitting here in Grand Rapids, just an hour and a half from where he was buried 300 years ago. When he discovered or first entered, you might say, in his canoe, the Mississippi River, in keeping with Jesuit practice at the time, he immediately consecrated it to the Immaculate Conception. And the Jesuits consecrated everything they could to the Immaculate Conception. And they consecrated the river. And that itself became such a looming central image in my thinking about things, because it speaks about something that visit to San Xavier del Bac also speaks of. And that is, we of course think of America traditionally as a Protestant country, but in fact, a country, a culture, a place is not defined by just what we do to it, the way Robert Frost sometimes suggests that America is ours because we took possession of it, though there's more to be said about Robert Frost. But in any case, it's rather, a place can be just as well, and in fact, perhaps better defined, not by what we do, but by what God brings. After all, he's the one who created it. And so the Americas, if we think of it as a stage where things happen, a stage where grace can enter, America has been from its earliest moments, from the Spanish missions that culminated in San Xavier del Bac and Junipero Serra's journey up the California seaboard, to the missions of the French Jesuits coming down the St. Lawrence Seaway and planting towns and missions and insinuating themselves into the lives of the American Indians. That's really, in a very profound sense, America's true founding, because it's the place where the Spirit of God was breathed into this continent and prepared it to take its place within his providence. That's a different kind of Catholic country than one founded with a Catholic regime or founded with a Protestant regime or anything like that. So this poem is about, as Frank's poem is a synthesis of all the American experiences of the Catholic faith, but with specific reference to Our Lady of the Immaculate Conception and Our Lady of Guadalupe, I tried to have my poem be as comprehensive as it could be in giving us a story of the American founding, but not merely in a narrative form, but also in a liturgical form. So the poem as a whole, in its 7 parts, follows very closely the progression of Frank's Mass, from the opening note through the presentation of the gifts and out through the final dismissal into the world. And within those liturgies, you might say, as the sort of readings and gospels are 3 saints' lives. The story of Saint Juan Diego, which is retold in a ballad measure, but as closely as possible following the original Aztec language text that contains the first recorded narrative of the revelation of Our Lady of Guadalupe. On to a poem in Alexandrine couplets, the classical French poetic form, retelling the story of Father Marquette's mission and journey down the Mississippi. And then it concludes in a deliberately early 19th century stanza to tell the story of Elizabeth Seton and her life and conversion. And I wanted the stanza and some aspects of it capture both the sort of high Anglican culture of colonial and post-colonial New York, but also a little bit of Jane Austen. I wanted to retell her story as a kind of Jane Austen novel in miniature. So that's the poem as a whole. I've talked so long about the poem. I don't know how much time I have left to share with you any of the poem, but I'll take a go at it, and I'll let Maggie interrupt me. So here's a presentation of the gifts, which begins as the gifts are being brought up in the Mass by a man dressed up as Juan Diego, actually, and a woman dressed up as Our Lady of the Guadalupe. And when you hear about people on their knees, it's the pilgrims who have come into the church to pray before Our Lady of Guadalupe in the image at the front of the church. What did they come for, those on bended knees, who scraped their weights along the temple stone? What did they come for, those retired in pews with faces elevated toward the cross? The crawling ceases in a posture of prayer, heads bowed before a woman clothed in sunlight, and silence covers everyone with waiting, between the moment when the word is spoken and that one still to follow, when the word will with a muttered word become our bread. They came first with a gaze of jewel-eyed wonder to find so rich a land, and one that grew with every legend of a golden city. De Vaca came for conquest, one hidalgo in search of honor lost in time, but found himself a naked pilgrim marched in chains, a blistered holy man, who signed the cross to drive the devil from the Indian's wounds. At last, a chaste colonial, dismayed as those he'd known, rode north to sate their lusts. We know Fray Cancer came to preach, though all his crew refused to land the boat, but watched as his white habit struggled through the waves, emerged, then bowed to prey upon the sand. Armed Indians watched as well, no less in awe, then dragged him to a grassy hummock, where they beat him with their clubs till he was dead. And in the little grotto where Rose prayed, shorn of her glory, fasting, crowned with iron, she suffered for the Christ and for this land. Her friend, the bastard of a slave, the humble sweeper of floors, de Porres, took the leper, the Indian stabbed and bleeding in the street, and bathed their wounds and gave them his own bed, until it seemed that cat, dog, bird, and mouse would sit at the same dish of milk and dine. And Sarah, bitten on the royal path, would limp his passion's way to California, extending with each step the Spanish Empire, but planting too a vineyard for the Lord. Why did we pass beneath the pilgrim's shell to step inside the mission of San Xavier that day, my wife and little girl and I? We stared up at the spread of florid columns, the drapery of stone about the Santos, their plaster faces stilled in holiness, and lean forms gowned in gaudy iridescence. The northern march of missions halted here, exhausted, foiled, but sure they'd come, not chasing gold cities, but to build of prayer and clay. So as much, Maggie, could I do two more, do you think?
Yeah, please.
So I won't give you the Father Marquette, though I have a recording of it that I'm very proud of. And I love that, the narrative. And one of the joys of working on this was entering into the lives of those early Catholic missionaries, settlers, and converts in our lands. And I discovered one of the secrets of writing a good narrative poem is that you can't look at any historians, even though Kevin Starr, the great Catholic historian, played a central role in the plotting out of this poem. And in fact, it's dedicated both to Frank LaRocca and to the memory of Kevin Starr. But I discovered that I really had to sink into the texts of the original authors. And so I went through all these historians of Father Marquette, and none of them were working. And finally, I got to the Jesuit Relations that includes his original notes and what he saw, the wild rice grasses along the river, etc. And I said, this is how you build a poem. And similar with St. Elizabeth Ann Seton, I read several wonderful books about her, including there's a young adults novel from the early 20th century that's really quite superb in its account of her life. But what I needed was to hear her. And so as it happens, one of her, she was married and the mother of children before her conversion and her entrance and her founding of her order of nuns. So one of her descendants, I think it was her grandson, who was a Monsignor in the late 19th century, gathered her letters together. And the letters were absolutely fantastic. And as soon as I entered into them, I said, I know the poem is all here. And in fact, this poem actually takes some of her words and only slightly tweaks them to have them fit my iambic meter. So here's the song of Elizabeth Seton. Elizabeth was just a girl and watched as her young mother died. Her father, in his Yankee way, went out and fetched another bride. And so it was that all her life, loss and renewal were close allied. Years on, her William's father passed and left 5 children fatherless. She who had young cares of her own took them still in her tenderness, and she became a second mother to raise and love and school and dress. The seas, a storm of piracy, beheadings in the squares of France, the fevers breaking in New York, amid a silken formal dance. Their house is strong built on good streets, but crumbling by each hour's mischance. Napoleon at Vienna's gates lays waste to all that Europe's been. Her father steps from bed to bed among immigrants in quarantine. The crowd of coarse and stricken Irish bow down in prayer upon the green. While she looks up at spangled stars spread over the city in the fall, brief letters coming from abroad call William's debts in desperate scrawl. And when her father dies, all she can do is sit and mend a shawl. But even as they lose their things, trade sensibility for sense, she, like her father, tends the sick, gives struggling widows her few cents, and claims the family pew to hear the Reverend Hobart's eloquence. We pay a debt for every pleasure, she writes, for beauty and for joy, and every suffering we may bear, if we the strength of God employ. Our merciful conductor veils those evils time cannot destroy. At last, their fortune seeking still, and William growing weak within, leaving all children save their Anne with those they once had taken in, they crossed to Italy in hopes some resurrection might begin. But thoughts of showing Anne those churches of worship sumptuous and splendid were in the harbor by armed guards with threatening bayonets upended. Not to Livorno's wharf, but to the Lazaretto they descended. Confined by bare walls and barred windows, she learned to contemplate her God. And though her body rest imprisoned, her soul was raised by love to laud. When Anna says, death frees us for him, such words from child lips leave her awed. And death was coming. Through the walls, December winds course sharp with brine, while they draw deeper in prayer, commune on slips of bread and wine, and helpless watch as William lies and coughs blood in his last decline. Yes, perfect prayer and happiness resemble in their stillness death. The soul may be drawn into God, though captive in the narrowest breath. All three knew heaven with their grief and left this world with will's last breath. Elizabeth passed from that prison into a Florentine chapel's dark, within whose depths the altar gold glistered with every taper spark, and seeing the rich and poor at prayer, she knew this was God's holy ark. And all her life she gave to it, sent forth from stillness into deed, to mother those who had no mother and teach the poor to pray and read, sent out as Mother Seton now to plant her country with faith's seed. And I'll just read one more. This is the last poem, and it's a stepping out of the narrative in part to reflect on what's transpired earlier in the poem, but also in Frank's Mass. And so this is a poem itself about the making of music, the making of poetry, and also the way in which the liturgy, the liturgical arts give us an anticipation or a sort of divinely inspired exemplar for the making of the arts. And most of the poems have titles from Frank's, from the words from Frank's score, and this is no exception. Hasten to aid thy fallen people. How does one make a song of holiness, or speak of music without spoiling it? They both seem more than our tongues can confess, and born above in our world do not fit. What's more, those who ascend with them are closed in on themselves, struck dumb, and all in ecstasy that they have heard seems flailing, foolish in a fallen word. But every rising strain must strain indeed to lend a form to what in truth is light, and manifest peace as if it's a deed, and give transcendence some arc of a flight. The purity of every saint will be daubed on with sloppy paint, and what no thought may comprehend or say must be taught in the staging of a play. The gift of form, because so fascinating as we bend down to work with knife or ruler, reminds us that beyond it's always waiting some piercing light. Consider how the jeweler makes every cut upon a stone for its own sake, but not that alone. His patient labor wasted if a line does not refract and multiply and shine. And any humble implement may serve to figure forth and yet conceal that light, so that high thought is felt upon each nerve and mystery is given to our sight. Just this way things are lifted up, a chalice wrought from wooden cup, a little dust and water mixed to clay are molded into birds that fly away. The Mass is first his earthen sacrifice, but also taste of peace and heaven's throne, the gift that leaves behind all thought of price, yet where no less we raise a plangent groan, for at its finish we are sent into the world both dark and bent, that bearing out the Virgin's hastening aid from ruined choirs, some good may be remade. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you, James. The gift of form. We could do like a seminar on that poem alone, I think. And I love the idea of doing a reading. We'll just have to talk again about that. But we really appreciate you and all your work and for being with us. I want to remind people the good thing about the fact that we're not doing the raffle reveal means that if you have not yet ordered a copy of the recording, there's a link that Kevin put. You can do so. And if you just email me the link, if you hit reply to the, you all have my email because you all got the newsletter and clicked on the link to register. So, but Kevin, maybe you put that, it's just mgallagher@bxvi.org. Hopefully we'll be back again to celebrate an entrance on the Billboard charts and maybe even we're hoping to be Blanton Alspaugh's 27th Grammy nomination. He keeps telling me not to get Grammy fever. I keep telling him that if I don't get excited, I'm not going to be able to excite anyone else. But the main thing is creating beautiful new works of art to honor the glory of God and the creative spirit. And thank you all for being part of this community. And when I was in college, we debated the topic, the true artist needs no audience, which we young punks thought was a very interesting thing. And I can think of no, as important as the creative impulse in itself is, it's you, the audience, who cares about it and who are uplifted by these works or challenged or informed by them, that give us the energy we need to continue the creative process. So with that, if you're in New York, we'll be doing an event on September 28th at the Union League Club. You can email me about that if you don't know about it. And stay tuned for the raffle reveal. If you get the newsletter this week, be sure to click and open it, and we'll let you know who's having dinner with the Archbishop. Thank you, and thanks, James. Thanks so much, Blanton, Matilda, Jay, wonderful to have you. Kevin, your help is always appreciated. God bless and good night until we meet again.
Thank you.